Okay, so we're ready to talk about the central nervous system. We finally finished up talking about the nervous tissue lecture that felt like it took us a year to get through. Hopefully you're able to digest that a little bit. Thinking back to the beginning of that lecture, we introduced the divisions of the nervous system, and we learned that there's two major divisions, the central nervous system and then the peripheral nervous system. Central nervous system contains the brain and spinal cord, which is why I've got the picture of Homer Simpson here. As you can see, his brain and spinal cord very nicely. The peripheral nervous system includes spinal nerves, cranial nerves. We will talk in this lecture about cranial nerves. It'll be the very last thing that we talk about, so we probably won't get that far today, but it will be discussed. So it's kind of a misleading lecture in that it says central nervous system, but we do talk just briefly about the peripheral nervous system with those cranial nerves. Okay. The kind of first, I don't know, 5, 8, 10 slides of this lecture is going to be more dedicated to things involving the spinal cord. But then from there on out, we're going to talk about the brain. And that's why we talk about the cranial nerves, because they connect to the brain. We'll pick more up with the spinal cord in our next lecture. I just kind of want to introduce it. But I would say most of this lecture, by 80%, I would say, is dedicated to the brain. Okay. Now, thinking back once again to that previous lecture that we discussed the other day, we learned that within both the spinal cord and our brain, there are two types of matter. Both, we've discussed this, gray and white matter. Gray matter has a relatively dull color because of the little myelin inside of it. Instead, it's going to be made up of unmyelinated axons. It's going to be the cell bodies of motor neurons, interneurons. Remember, cell bodies are where the nucleus is. It's going to be the dendrites, the axon terminals, all those things that wouldn't have myelin. Okay, the myelin that causes the white matter to appear white is not here, so that's why we see it being more gray. And the gray also is due to these structures called missile bodies. They're a type of organelle that we find in the cell bodies of our neurons. Okay, what's important though is we can describe the gray matter as the site of synaptic contact between neurons, and therefore is the site of all synaptic integration or information processing in our central nervous system. That's a big, heavy loaded sentence. Okay, remember, synaptic contacts is the stuff that we talked about on Tuesday, where two neurons meet and neurotransmitters are released. Okay, that connection where there's not actual physical touching, but there's that tiny little gap called the synaptic cleft. So it's where two neurons are meeting, or in many cases, it's lots and lots and lots of neurons, because we're talking about billions of neurons in our brain and spinal cord. Okay, but this is where we're processing information. Okay, deciding what to do with that information coming in from the sensory neurons, deciding what to do and how to provide a response. Okay, like when we're cold and we shiver. Okay, something that we all do on a day like today. Okay, white matter has a bright white appearance, once again due to the abundance of myelin, composed of long bundles of axons called tracts that carry signals up and down our spinal cord. Okay, think of your spinal cord as far as the white matter goes like an elevator. Okay, an elevator does two things: it goes up and it goes down, right? Okay, well, with the white matter, we have what we call ascending or sensory tracts. Okay, literally the word ascending means going up. Okay, well, those are the signals that are going to be, or those are going to be carrying signals that are ultimately going to go, in many cases, up into our brain from somewhere, lower down, whether that's all the way down at the bottom of the spinal cord or up there in the neck. Okay, whereas motor or descending tracts are going to be carrying the signal down, in many cases, from higher places like the brain. Now, keep in mind, we have those types of tracts in our brain as well, but we also have some other types of tracts. Our brain's a little more complicated with the tracts, and we'll talk about that later in the lecture. But we have some that can cross from one side of the brain to the other. So communication can be between the left and right parts of our brain. We also have some that can carry a signal from the front of the brain to the back of the brain, or vice versa. So that's kind of cool. Looking at this picture on the next page, it gives you a good illustration on the spinal cord. It's a fairly simplified illustration where we can see some neurons, and what we really get a good view of is that gray matter, white matter. Okay, gray matter is on the inside, made up of what we call horns, and they create basically a capital H shape. I don't like how the figures kind of turn the way it is, but that's okay. And then surrounding that inner gray matter is the white matter. Okay, now let's talk about these different horns in the gray matter. have a pair of each of these first two listed here, dorsal horn and ventral horn. Okay, the dorsal horns listed here as dorsal gray horns. You might also see them listed as posterior gray horns because dorsal and posterior mean the same thing, towards the back of the body. And that's more of an anatomy based thing. But inside of those dorsal horns is where a sensory signal is able to come in by way of sensory neurons. So they're going to be carrying action potentials for sensations like itch and tickle and hot and cold, things, you know, that we've talked about and we'll talk more about here in the future. Okay, remember, most sensory neurons are unipolar in structure. So we discussed in that previous lecture. Here's an example of one of those unipolar neurons. They come in due to the structure known as the dorsal root of our spinal nerve, and then they synapse inside of that dorsal horn. Okay, they're going to synapse with interneurons. Remember, interneurons, excuse me, interneurons are neurons that are strictly found in the central nervous system. In this case, it's strictly found in the gray matter. Okay, but that's going to be where the processing of that sensory signal takes place. Okay, and then, you know, if we have like a reflex arc, in some cases, what's going to happen is the signal is going to go right back out where we synapse with that interneuron and a somatic motor neuron, which is, as we know, somatic, associated with controlling our skeletal muscles. Okay, your gray matter of the spinal cord enables us to perform what we call reflexes. Okay, it acts like a reflex arc where a signal can come in, it's processed, and then we decide what to do with it by sending a signal out. Okay, something like this happens, you know, on a very routine basis, like when you touch something hot, like what was in that video I showed you guys the other day. That way we don't have to send that signal all the way up to the brain, decide what to do with it. We can process it in our spinal cord and then send that signal out really, really quickly so that we don't have too much damage to our skin, or, you know, whatever that thing is that's getting burned. Okay, the knee jerk reflex that I kind of talked about the other day, where you sit on the table at the doctor's office, they tap on your patellar tendon. That's another example of a spinal reflex. Okay, now this, as I said just a little bit ago, is a fairly simplified illustration of the spinal cord because it's just showing you kind of how simple it can be. But in many situations, most situations, when a sensory signal comes in, okay, what we need to do is transmit that sensory signal up into the brain. Okay, which means that we're going to utilize the white matter where those sensory or ascending tracts are, like an elevator, carry that signal up. Okay, in some cases, what we'll see, and you'll see a figure that demonstrates this here in a couple of slides, we need the signal to come across to the other side of the spinal cord, and that's where this crossbar of the H comes in, and that's called the gray commutator. It just connects the right and left sides. Okay, now the dorsal horns, once again, are going to be where the sensory signal is coming in. The ventral or gray or anterior gray horns are going to be where you find the cell bodies of somatic motor neurons. And then in certain segments of the spinal cord, you're also going to find what we call lateral horns. Okay? And these are only present between T1 and L1 vertebrae, which, if you think about, you know, that's like the middle segment of your spinal column. Basically, that's kind of the middle part of your torso. And as we know, the autonomic nervous system, which we see the word autonomic motor neuron there, is the division of our nervous system that's associated with controlling things like our cardiac muscle, our smooth muscle, and our glands, doing so in a involuntary manner or automatic way. Okay. Well, hopefully it makes kind of good sense that we've got these types of neurons originating in these lateral horns around organs that are near the middle part of your torso. And think about all those organs that are in the middle part of your torso: your lungs, your heart, your intestines. Basically, most of the organs that are controlled involuntarily are kind of just in that general area. Not all of them, but many of them are. Now, at the center of the crossbar, it's not really a physiological structure as far as action potentials go, but it is very important. It's a little chamber or canal, as its name is, where we find circulating cerebrospinal fluid. Okay, it's continuous with some chambers in our brain where we find cerebrospinal fluid. We'll talk more about those and cerebrospinal fluid here in a little bit. Okay, but that's something I also wanted to point out. Okay. Now, that's all the gray matter of the spinal cord. Okay? In our brain, the gray matter forms a very thin shell on the very outside of the two largest parts of our brain, the cerebrum and the cerebellum. Okay. In our picture here on the next page, we show a frontal section of the brain where we can see that thin shell, and this would be in the cerebrum. So we would call this the cerebral cortex. If we were looking at the thin shell of gray matter in the cerebellum, we'd call it the cerebellar cortex. Okay. Now, your cerebral cortex is, in my opinion, the part of our brain that really separates us from other animals. Okay, it's the part of our brain that allows you to understand what I'm saying, allow you to understand and process what you're seeing right now, looking up at the board or on your screen. It's what allows you to have, you know, your individual uniqueness, your personality, your conscience, and your intellect, all those different things. And we'll get into all that. And there's a lot of insane, amazing things that are courtesy of that cerebral cortex, which is just a very thin shell of gray matter on the outside of our cerebrum. Okay. So when we look at both the brain and the spinal cord, we can see that the white matter in the spinal cord is on the outside, whereas in the brain, it's on the inside. And it's the reverse for the gray matter. It's on the inside, forming that capital H in our spinal cord. And then it's the very thin outer part on our brain. And we kind of already talked about that stuff in our previous lecture. So here is that illustration that I said was a little bit more accurate on showing you how the spinal cord works, and with crossing over and involving the white matter in those different tracks. Okay. So it's a little bit better than the one that we saw a couple slides ago, but that's okay. The one a couple slides ago wasn't terrible. I've already kind of talked about the first bullet there, but the organization of the gray matter allows it to function as a reflex arc, where a sensory signal enters the spinal cord thanks to those sensory neurons, and they come into the posterior or dorsal gray horn. We then synapse with interneurons located inside of the gray matter. We process that. In some cases, we might send the signal across to the other side. We might then send the signal up to the brain. So we associate with the white matter. Okay. And in a lot of cases, the signal goes right back out the other side of the spinal cord using the anterior or the ventral gray horns, where you find the cell bodies of somatic motor neurons that then go out to our skeletal muscle. Okay. Now, those white matter tracks that I've been talking about, once again, already kind of talked about this, but think of your spinal cord when it comes to white matter like an elevator carrying signals up and down. Shown in blue there are the sensory ascending tracks that conduct nerve impulses up toward the brain. And then in red there, you see an example of a motor or descending tract, which is going to consist of axons that conduct impulses down from the brain. Okay. Descending or motor mean the same thing with that regard. Now let's talk a little bit more about those tracks. Okay. Aside from helping to perform reflexes, which we'll talk more about reflexes and the spinal cord's action in that in our next lecture. We won't get to that today. Your spinal cord also promotes homeostasis by propagating action potentials along these tracks. Okay. The name of a tract often indicates its position in the white matter and where it begins and ends. Okay. As we've already said, the white matter contains both sensory and motor tracks. Okay. When a nerve impulse travels up from sensory receptors into the spinal cord, it then travels to the brain along two main routes on each side, what we call the spinothalamic tract and the posterior column. Okay. Spinothalamic tract is going to convey nerve impulses for sensing pain, warmth, coolness, itching, and tickling. So if you're experiencing any of those sensations and you're aware that you're experiencing those sensations, it's because you're carrying signals up your spinal cord using this spinothalamic tract, and they ultimately travel into the cerebral cortex. Okay. The other major tract is the posterior column, and there's actually two tracts, the gracile fasciculus and cuneate fasciculus, two kind of complicated terms there. But the posterior column convey, or posterior tract column tracks convey nerve impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, and then one of the hardest sensations to kind of describe and understand is this, what we call conscious proprioception. Okay, conscious proprioception is our awareness of the positions and movements of our muscles, tendons, and joints. So it's not balance, but it plays a role in balance. Basically, it's kind of like your body's awareness of itself in space. Okay. Now, as far as all the information that's on this page, main thing I want you to take away is like the different sensory or different sensations that the spinothalamic tract carries, and then the tracks for the posterior column, what are the four senses that they're carrying. Okay, so those are going up. Okay, well, now let's talk about signals coming down. Okay, and so we can trace that in many cases back up into the brain, and that part of our brain that I've been talking about already, the cerebral cortex, is that thin outer part of our cerebrum. It plays a major role in controlling very precise voluntary muscular movements. So like when you're writing your notes, flipping your page to turn it, okay, scratching your beard like I do from time to time, or just standing up, doing anything. Okay, we can pretty much trace those motions back to the cerebral cortex. Okay, and we'll talk about that specific part of our cerebral cortex later in this lecture. Okay, but other brain regions are important for providing integration for regulating autonomic movements. So those that are associated with autonomic control. So, more of the cardiac muscle, smooth muscle, and glands, not the skeletal muscle, which is voluntarily controlled. Okay. The motor output to our skeletal muscles is going to travel down the spinal cord in two types of descending pathways. So these are going to be carrying the signals down. We call the pathways the direct and indirect. Okay, as far as the direct pathways go, there are several tracks. I'm not even going to list them off because they have big fat names and I don't really care about you knowing their names. But what I want you to know is that the direct pathway or pathways are going to carry nerve impulses originating in the cerebral cortex that are eventually going to be destined to cause voluntary movements of skeletal muscle. So as you're taking your notes, as you're standing up and you're yawning and moving your body, you're using the direct pathways originating in the brain, carried out eventually to our skeletal muscles. Whereas the indirect pathways, in the same situation, we got a lot of big words that I'm not going to worry about you knowing. Okay, what you do want to know is that they convey nerve impulses from our brain stem, causing automatic movements. Okay, and in this case, they're still automatic, but they are still associated with not skeletal or not cardiac muscle, smooth muscle. It's still skeletal muscle because there are some automatic things involved with our skeletal muscle, things like muscle tone, which is where our muscles are very weakly contracted all the time, even if we feel like they're relaxed. Posture, so like keeping your spine straight up and down vertically. Balance, and then orientation of your head and body, which are just basically automatically done for us, and that's because of this set of indirect pathway tracks. Okay. Nice mapping here of the different tracks are shown at the bottom. In red, they've got the motor or descending tracks, and then in blue would be the sensory ascending tracks. But I'm not really worried about you knowing the figure or anything like that. Just kind of make sure you know the kind of two major things here on this page, and then back on this page, those two tracks and what those sensory signals are carried by. Okay, so at this point, we're going to take a break talking about the spinal cord, and we're going to jump in on the brain, and we will continue to talk about our brain for the remainder of the lecture. Before we start talking about what the different parts of our brain do, I want to kind of talk about some general stuff. First of all, how we feed it, something very, very important, because even though our adult human brain only represents about 2% of our total body weight, it consumes about 20% of our oxygen and glucose, even at rest. Okay, so that's a very significant amount for something pretty small. Okay, and if you think about it, you don't survive very long without blood going to your brain. That's why, if you are strangled, it, only is a matter of minutes before you pass out and then pass away. Okay. Well, why do we need to provide so much blood flow to our brain? This is because neurons synthesize ATP almost exclusively from glucose via reactions that use oxygen. In other words, neurons like to make their ATP aerobically. Okay? What's cool is doctors and scientists were able to figure out what parts of the brain did what, because if you trace the flow of blood, you're going to essentially be able to follow where it goes in the brain and figure out what that part of the brain does. When activity of neurons and neuroglia increase in a region of the brain, blood flow to that area also increases. So you just follow where the blood goes, and then that's what part of the brain does what. Okay? Because virtually no glucose is stored in the brain, and reactions used to make ATP from glucose, the supply of glucose and oxygen in the brain must be continuous. If we do have blood that's low in glucose entering our brain, it can cause mental confusion, dizziness, convulsions, and even possible loss of consciousness. And if not treated, could be, the death of the individual, something that, people with diabetes would obviously need to be very, very careful of, because their blood can become very low in glucose, a condition called hypoglycemia. We'll talk about that later on semester. Okay, something that we talked a little bit about in our previous lecture was the blood-brain barrier, which is exactly what it sounds like. Review the BBB, the barrier that prevents certain things from our blood leaving and interfering with normal brain and spinal cord function. Okay, we learned in that lecture it's formed by what we call astrocytes, and we can see a couple of their processes wrapping around a blood capillary here. Okay, it's going to help prevent things that are harmful, whether those are pathogens, like viruses and bacteria, or certain drugs, waste products from passing from the blood into our brain. Now, that doesn't mean we completely shut the brain and those neurons of our brain and spinal cord away from our blood. Certain things absolutely have to, like that oxygen, like water, those things absolutely have to travel through and across the blood-brain barrier. Okay, so a few water-soluble molecules or substances like glucose can cross the blood-brain barrier by facilitated fusion, meaning they need to transport proteins to carry them across. Other substances like creatinine, urea, most ions can cross it very slowly. Things that are lipid soluble like oxygen, carbon dioxide, steroid hormones, alcohol, barbiturates, nicotine, caffeine easily cross the blood-brain barrier. In cases like O2, CO2, remember, they can just go directly through cells like this cell here that's lining this capillary through simple diffusion. Okay, I'm sure everybody knows what most of these things are: O2, CO2, steroid hormones, alcohol, nicotine, which is in like cigarettes and chewing tobacco, caffeine. We don't know what that's in caffeinated beverages like pop and coffee and that kind of stuff. You might not recognize what we call barbiturates. Barbiturates was a class of drugs that were prescribed, not so much anymore. It was quite a while ago, a couple decades ago, on a pretty regular basis to treat a lot of different mental health issues, things like seizures and anxiety and stuff like that. But they were super, super habit forming and addictive, and were not good. And so since then, since a long time, we've developed, not we, I didn't, but doctors and scientists have come up with better drugs than barbiturates. So you don't really see those around anymore. Okay, so those are things that can easily cross the blood-brain barrier. We have also things that absolutely will not. Things like proteins and most antibiotic drugs cannot pass at all from the blood into brain tissue, which is good because they could interfere with normal brain functioning, and that wouldn't be good. Now, closely associated with our blood-brain barrier is the fluid that's formed when stuff leaves the blood, like water and ions and whatnot. We call this the cerebrospinal fluid. Another thing that we talked a little bit about not only earlier today in this lecture, but also in a previous lecture when we talked about ependymal cells, another one of those neuroglia supporting cells. Cerebrospinal fluid, abbreviated CSF, can be described as a clear, colorless liquid, protects our brain and spinal cord from chemical and physical injuries. And it's not just water, it's predominantly water, but it has a lot of other stuff, and therefore it's going to do things like carry oxygen and glucose as well as other needed chemicals from our blood to neurons and neuroglia. Where we have it is in certain cavities of our brain called ventricles. And in that central canal of the spinal cord that I talked about earlier at the center of the H. And it's going to continuously circulate throughout those cavities in both the brain and spinal cord. So once again, demonstrating that it's a fluid that's like a river, not like a pond, staying stagnant. It's circulating. Okay. We don't have a lot of it. In fact, there's a very small amount of it. It's only about 80 to 150 mils total, which is about 3 to 5 ounces. And I got a Dr. Pepper can here. Each can of Dr. Pepper is 12 fluid ounces. So if you think 3 to 5, it's not even half of one of these. It's a very small amount of cerebrospinal fluid, but very, very important. And it's very abundant with other stuff aside from water. It has glucose, proteins, lactic acid, urea, a lot of different cation ions. Remember, those are positively charged things like sodium, potassium, calcium. Talked a lot about those ions the other day. So as magnesium, anions like chloride and bicarbonate, as well as some white blood cells. Okay. So what does it do for us as far as homeostasis goes? Well, it provides two forms of protection, mechanical and chemical, and then it helps with circulation. Okay. Mechanically, it protects by serving as a shock absorbing medium, protecting the delicate tissues of our brain and spinal cord from jolts that would otherwise cause them to hit the bony walls of our cranial cavity and the vertebral canal. Essentially allows the brain and spinal cord to kind of float in their two cavities so that when we do, turn our head quickly, or when we have to, slam on the brakes and our head gets pushed forward, the brain doesn't just like slam into the walls of your, cranial cavity and the walls of your vertebral cavity. So it keeps you from having concussions. Okay? It's obviously not 100% effective at that, but it does at least do the best that it can. Okay. Chemically, it provides an optimal chemical environment for accurate neuronal signaling. In other words, it keeps levels of sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride, and those other ions at the right numbers in the extracellular fluid. Remember the other day we talked about how ions moving in and out of a neuron create action potentials, how calcium comes into the synaptic end bulb and triggers a release of neurotransmitters in a synapse. Okay, if you have just slight alterations in ion number, that can seriously screw up or disrupt action potential production. And so cerebrospinal fluid helps keep those numbers the way they should be. Okay, and then finally, circulation. I've already kind of talked about this, but it allows exchange of nutrients and waste products between our blood and our nervous tissue. So it circulates the good stuff and gets the bad stuff out. Okay, so now that we've got the kind of background out of the way, we can start actually diving in on the fun stuff and learning about what your brain does. Okay. Reading through here, solving an equation, feeling hungry, laughing, those are just things that we kind of probably do on a daily basis. I'll be solving serious math equations, but I imagine we all add and subtract on a daily basis. And the neural processes needed for each of these activities occur in different regions of our brain. We're going to describe our brain as a portion of our central nervous system contained within the cranium, made up of about 85 billion neurons. That's an incredible number. Even more incredible is the number of neuroglia. 10 to 50 trillion neuroglia make up our brain. And that's a lot of cells. Okay? Remember neuroglia, like those astrocytes and ependymal cells, those are the supporting cells. The neurons are the ones that we talked a lot about in our last lecture, performing action potentials. Okay. Size-wise, I've already mentioned this, but very small, about 1,300 grams or about 3 pounds in adults. Okay. Which isn't the biggest brain that you find in animals, but it pound for pound, as far as like percentage of our total body, it's pretty darn big, especially our cerebrum and the cerebral cortex. We can describe our brain as a control center for registering sensations, correlating them with one another and with stored information, making decisions and taking actions, responsible as well for our intellect, our emotions, our behavior, and our memory. So a lot takes place courtesy of our brain. Now there are kind of 4 specific divisions to the adult brain. each of which works and accomplishes specific functions. We'll start by talking about the brain stem. There's kind of three parts to the brain stem: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. Those are the most inferior parts of the brain. Just above the brain stem is what we call the diencephalon. That includes the structure called the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus. Kind of in behind both of those, especially more so behind the brain stem, is the second largest part of our brain, what we call the cerebellum. We can see that very nicely here. You don't want to confuse the cerebellum with the cerebrum, which is the largest part of our brain. Cerebellum, cerebrum, those terms are very similar sounding and spelled, but very different. Cerebrum is basically everything above the diencephalon. It is the part of our brain that we'll spend several slides talking about and hopefully grow to appreciate how amazing it is. Not to take anything away from any other part of the brain, because every part of the brain is important in many ways. So let's find out how they're important. Okay, like I said, we'll start at the bottom with the medulla, which is what I usually call it, medulla oblongata. That's kind of full-size name. Within the medulla, we find what we call nuclei that are components of the sensory pathways for three special senses: gestation, which is a fancy word for taste; audition, which is a fancy word for hearing; and equilibrium, which is a fancy word for balance. We have five special senses. The medulla oblongata helps carry signals for three of those five. Okay. Now, this term you see here, nuclei, is the plural form of nucleus, which we've been talking about a nucleus since a couple lectures ago when we talked about cells and we talked about the nucleus of an atom. Before that, okay, when you see the word nucleus, or in this case nuclei, when discussing the brain or spinal cord, that's referring to the cell bodies of multiple neurons. Okay, remember what we just learned is your brain's made up of about 85 billion neurons. Okay, what you're going to find is that those 85 billion neurons kind of put themselves together in a coordinated manner. What that means is, and if you think back to the anatomy of a neuron, okay, when you have a cluster of neurons, you're going to find all the cell bodies together. You're going to find all the axons together. Okay, you're going to find the same parts put together. A collection of neurons and their cell bodies is what a nucleus is. Okay. So you're going to see this word nuclei a lot, not only on this slide, but in several slides here in this lecture. Just know that when talking in the brain about nuclei, we're talking about neurons grouped together, and specifically their cell bodies are grouped together. Okay, which makes sense, hopefully, because inside the cell body is where you'd find the nucleus of a singular neuron. Okay. Now, those neurons that are part of those three special sensory pathways include the gestatory nucleus involved with gestation, taste, cochlear nuclei, which is the one associated with hearing. I can tell you that because I know the cochlea is the organ in our inner ear for hearing, and then the vestibular nuclei is associated with balance, and that's because the vestibule. We'll talk more about those things next unit. Okay. So your medulla is involved with special senses. It's also associated with and contains nuclei with some of our just general senses. So things like touch, pressure, vibration. There's that term conscious proprioception again. The nuclei there are known as the gracile nucleus and the cuneate nucleus. And as far as the exam goes, I'm not going to ask you to know like the names of all the nuclei and that kind of stuff, because that's going to add up. You're just going to want to know like the main things as far as like what pathways for sensation they are. Okay. Associated with the medulla are the cranial nerves, or the nuclei associated with cranial nerves. 8, which is the vestibulocochlear. 9, which is the glossopharyngeal. 10, vagus. 11, accessory, and 12, hypoglossal. Okay. And this is why we're going to talk about the cranial nerves later in the lecture. Once we've discussed them, you'll understand what each of these different cranial nerves does for us. Okay. Remember, every cranial nerve is in a pair. So there's two vestibulocochlear nerves, there's two vagus nerves, and so on and so forth. Okay. But these, was it 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pairs connect and are associated with our medulla. Okay. The last thing on this slide I want to talk about, there's some more about the medulla on the next page, but I want to talk about the primitive visceral and somatic functions that your medulla helps control. These first 3 bullets here, you're going to want to put a big fat star on them, highlight them. And those, in my opinion, are the most important things that our medulla do. Okay. We can describe our medulla as the major regulator of our entire cardiovascular system. We haven't talked about the cardiovascular system in this class yet. We will. It'll be much later in the semester. Which cardiovascular system is the division of our system that includes things like your heart, your blood vessels, and then the blood inside. Okay. Well, you can control the flow of blood by controlling your heart and by controlling your blood vessels. Your medulla helps regulate both of those structures. Okay. The cardiac center of our medulla regulates the rate and the force of each heartbeat. Okay. So how often and how strong of a beat your heart is, performing. So when you measure your pulse, you put your fingers on your neck or on your wrists, okay, you're measuring your heart rate. Okay. When you feel your chest and you can feel it beating really hard or really soft, you're feeling what we call the force of heartbeat. That's actually called contractility. We'll get into that later. The vasomotor center of the medulla adjusts blood vessel diameter. So either it makes the blood vessel more open to increase blood flow, or it kind of pinches it shut to decrease blood flow. And in doing so, that helps regulate blood pressure and can help reroute blood from one part of the body to another. Okay. The third bullet, what we call the medullary rhythmicity area, which you can literally see the word medulla at the beginning of it, is a regulator of our breathing rate. Okay. So not only does it control how often our heart beats, but it also controls how often we breathe. Okay. Like right now, at a resting state, not very many breaths are taken per minute, like 12, 15. But if I ask you guys to get up and jog in place for 2 minutes, what's going to happen to your breathing rate? It's going to go up. Okay. Your medullary rhythmicity area helps trigger that. Okay. Now, obviously, these 3 bullets here involve very, very important things: beating a heart, pumping of blood, movement of blood throughout the body, breathing. Those are things that are, critical things. Okay. Not quite as critical are some other reflexes involving the medulla, things like vomiting, swallowing, sneezing, coughing, and hiccuping. They still play important things, but I would say not quite as important as breathing and beating your heart. Now, last thing I want to talk about with the medulla is the white matter that helps to form these things called pyramids. Okay. Within the medulla, white matter is going to pass through for all sensory or ascending and motor or descending tracts, carrying signals between your spinal cord and other parts of the brain. Okay. If we go back to this illustration, okay, we see that the spinal cord is right here, and then just above it is the medulla. Okay. Any signal that's going up the spinal cord, ultimately into the cerebrum, or down from the brain into the spinal cord, has to go through the medulla first. Okay. And so that's how it's involved. Some of the white matter of our medulla forms bulges on its anterior side. We can see them shown here in this picture. We call these bulges pyramids. Okay. They're formed by large corticospinal tracts, and these are the tracts that control voluntary movements of our limbs and trunks. So in other words, when we move our arms, when we twist our body, when we do any type of motion of our arms, legs, and trunk, those signals are coming through these pyramids. And what we see is that these pyramids decussate. They go through decussation or crossing over. And you can see it's like a little X is formed by them. About 90% of the axons in the left pyramid cross to the right, and vice versa, 90% in the right cross to the left, before continuing up and down, either into the brain or out of the brain. Okay. And if you've ever learned this before, now you'll know why, but your right side of your brain is what triggers motion on the left side of the body. So if you're writing with your right hand right now to take notes, your left brain is controlling that. Or if you're a lefty, the right side of your brain is controlling that. And did you guys know that before?
Kind of knew that. I didn't know why.
Well, now you definitely know why. Okay, sitting just on top of the medulla is your pons. Okay, this is just like an anterior bulge in the brainstem, superior to the medulla. Like the medulla, consists of both nuclei and tracts. The term pons actually means bridge, and that's because this is basically a bridge. And like a bridge, it connects things. Okay. In case of the pons, it connects different parts of the brain with one another. Some axons in the pons connect the right and left sides of the cerebellum, while others are part of ascending sensory tracts and descending motor tracts. Okay. So not only do signals going up and down from the spinal cord or down from the brain to the spinal cord have to pass through the medulla, they also have to pass through the pons, because the pons is right on top of that. Okay. Now, there's two major structural components to your pons, what we call the ventral and dorsal regions. The ventral region forms a large synaptic relay station consisting of scattered gray centers called pontine nuclei. Okay. Well, they provide a connection between the cortex of a cerebral hemisphere and that of the opposite hemisphere of the cerebellum. Another example of crossing over, this time in the pons from the cerebral cortex to the cerebellum. Okay. The function of those pontine nuclei is to play an essential role in coordinating and maximizing efficiency of voluntary motor contractions throughout the body. So there's help make sure we're efficiently contracting our muscles. Okay. The dorsal region contains ascending and descending tracts along with the nuclei of cranial nerves. And let's go ahead and just talk about those cranial nerves. I'll skip this bullet. Cranial nerves 5, which is your trigeminal pair, 6 abducens, 7 would be the parafacial, and 8 vestibulocochlear are associated with your pons. Okay. I would definitely put a big fat star or highlight this third bullet. Talk about that now. Within the pons is what we call the pontine respiratory group, which contains 2 areas, the pneumotaxic and apneusic areas. And those are also part of your respiratory center. And together with the medulla, that medullary rhythmicity area that we just talked about, they help in controlling our breathing. Okay. So between your pons and your medulla, they help regulate your breathing. Now, I'm really saying just generally they help control breathing. Well, what does that really mean? I'm not going to worry about you knowing that at this point. Okay. When we talk about breathing and we talk about the respiratory system, we'll find out what your pneumotaxic apneusic areas really do. Just for now, just know that they help you breathe. Okay. Okay, sitting on top of your pons is what we call the midbrain or mesencephalon. I always call it the midbrain. It's a short segment of the brainstem connecting the pons to the diencephalon. And if I go back to this picture again, you can see it's labeled with 2 arrows. You might be wondering why 2 different things are labeled. Well, coming right down through the center of it is one of those chambers I was talking about where we find cerebrospinal fluid circulating. This structure is called the aqueduct of the midbrain or cerebral aqueduct, and it's got cerebrospinal fluid circulating through it. And so that's why that figure kind of looks like you're pointing to 2 different things, but it's really just one, just like having a river between 2 parts of the city. Okay, just cuts it in half. Your midbrain will consist of both nuclei and tracts, just like the first 2 things we've talked about. Okay, the anterior part of your midbrain contains paired bundles of axons known as cerebral peduncles, and these are axons of motor tracts conducting nerve impulses from the cerebral cortex to the spinal cord to the pons and the medulla. Posterior part we call the tectum contains 4 rounded elevations, and the 2 superior elevations are called the superior colliculi, and they are going to help regulate reflexes associated with vision. So various visual activities Things like tracking or visually tracking moving objects. So like when you're driving, you're gonna have to use these when you're, catching something when somebody throws it at you. When you're reading the board right now, it's a stationary thing. You're scanning it, you're reading it, you're using those superior colliculi to do that. Okay. Other things like reflexes governing movements of your head, eyes, and trunk in response to visual stimuli. Thinking about like, when you're out and about and you see somebody or something in the corner of your eye, you kind of turn in that direction. That's a reflex involving the superior colliculi. The two inferior elevations are called inferior colliculi, and they are associated with auditory stuff. Auditory meaning hearing. Okay, they are part of the auditory pathway, relaying impulses from our inner ear to our brain. Okay, one of the most important things they are involved with is what we call the startle reflex. And I usually generally do that and see if I can get anybody to demonstrate it. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the startle reflex is going to cause movements of your head, eyes, and trunk caused by sudden loud noises like a gunshot or me clapping my hands when you're not ready for it. It's a protective mechanism. Loud noise might be something dangerous. So you crouch, you kind of look at that direction the noise is coming from because you're, hopefully gonna, if it is dangerous, be able to protect yourself. Okay, midbrain also contains left and right red nuclei, which are sites of synapses between axons from the cerebellum and the cerebral cortex, which help control some voluntary movement of limbs. And then cranial nerves 3, which is your oculomotor, and 4 trochlear are going to be associated with the midbrain. One more part of the midbrain I wanted to talk about, which I kind of talked a little bit about the other day, is what we call the substantia nigra. Substantia nigra is one of several nuclei in the midbrain releasing dopamine. There's that neurotransmitter we talked about the other day. Remember, I described it as like the feel-good chemical released like, during pleasurable experiences, addictive behaviors. Okay. We also described in that last lecture that dopamine is involved with subconsciously controlling body movements. And unfortunately, we talked a little bit about this, but it's a loss of these neurons associated with Parkinson's disease. Once again, that's that progressive disorder of the CNS, and it's described a lot better here than it was in the last lecture. People that have PD have involuntary skeletal muscle contractions that interfere with any voluntary movements that they might want to do. So they're constantly jittering, moving their hands in ways that they cannot stop, they can't control. Typically, it affects victims around the age 60. Talked about Michael J. Fox. He, I think, was like in his 40s when he was diagnosed, and unfortunately, he still suffers from it today. There are treatments that help alleviate it, but there's no cure, no way to prevent it. It's just a crappy situation for those people. Okay, our next structure is actually not really kind of a structure, but more of a collection of structures called the reticular formation. Okay, if I go back to our kind of first picture of a brain, you won't be able to just pinpoint and label the reticular formation. That's why it's not included here. But the reticular formation is a small cluster of gray matter interspersed within the white matter of the brainstem and certain regions of the spinal cord, the diencephalon, and the cerebellum. So in other words, you just got a lot of gray matter kind of just sprinkled in throughout these kind of just general areas, down from the spinal cord up, all the way up towards the thalamus and hypothalamus. Okay. Part of this reticular formation, what we call the reticular activating system, consists of sensory axons projecting to the cerebral cortex. Okay. Your RAS is responsible for many things, possibly the most important of which is the maintenance of consciousness. Consciousness is defined as a state of wakefulness in which an individual is fully alert, aware, and oriented. Something that I always hope that my students are experiencing and exhibiting is consciousness. Unfortunately, as I talk for hours on end, sometimes I can inactivate the RAS of my students and trigger them to fall asleep, which is defined as a state of partial consciousness from which an individual can be aroused. Arousal is just waking up from sleep, and that's going to involve the RAS as well. Okay, we all know what can wake you up, things like loud noises or just getting enough sleep, being tapped on the shoulder or shooken, toss a bucket of water in someone's face, that's going to make them wake up real awfully. So it's like sensory things can trigger people to wake up. One sensation that actually won't help you wake up is smell. You can't smell while you're asleep. Well, that might sound obvious, and why would I even bring that up? But if you've ever wondered why we need a smoke alarm in your house might be filled with smoke, which if you were awake, you'd be able to smell, but if you're asleep, you won't smell. But that smoke detector or smoke alarm is going to start beeping when it detects that smoke, and that will wake you up and hopefully end up saving your life or allowing you to put out the fire. Now, sleep is where you can be aroused from that partial consciousness, whereas when you damage the RAS, it can cause a coma, and that's a state of unconsciousness from which an individual cannot be aroused. Okay. So you can't shake them, you can't toss water in their face, they're not going to wake up. The RAS helps with maintaining attention, like the concentration on a single object or thought, as well as alertness. Hopefully those are other things that you're experiencing. Your RAS helps prevent sensory overload by filtering out unimportant sensory information. Okay, like the buzzing of the overhead projector that's currently happening in my room that I'm teaching in. When I teach this class on the main campus in Highland, my classroom there is right next to the main drag, and there are times where semis drive by and tractors drive by. At one time, I had a semi come barreling down the road as I was talking, made a whole bunch of noise, and then I asked my students if they even heard them, and nobody said yes, which made me happy. They were able to just filter that out and pay attention to me, which made me feel good. And then finally, the RAS also helps with maintaining muscular tone, which I mentioned earlier, slight degree of involuntary contraction and normal resting skeletal muscles. So illustration here just kind of shows that interaction between the different parts of the reticular formation, where they're at, how it's basically connected to everything, especially things like our cerebral cortex. Okay, moving on from the brainstem, can now talk about the cerebellum. Now, aside from its name, cerebellum and the cerebrum are very similar. Okay, cerebellum, cerebrum, spelled similar, sound similar, but they also are structured pretty similarly. Okay, both the cerebrum and the cerebellum, if I just go back to this page, have folds on the outside, increasing surface area. Okay, both the cerebrum and the cerebellum are split into two sides, and that's what's actually done here. Cut the brain in half. You have two what we call hemispheres. Okay, if we're talking about the hemispheres of the cerebrum, we classify them as right and left cerebellar hemispheres. Okay, if we're talking about the cerebrum, there'd be cerebral hemispheres. Okay, in the case of the cerebellar hemispheres, they're connected by a narrow bridge called the vermis. Looks like a little worm, and I believe that's actually what the word vermis means. Not that that's very important. Each of those hemispheres can then be divided up into smaller lobes by deep and distinct fissures. Okay, so that's another similarity that we'll see here when we get to the cerebrum. Each hemisphere of your cerebrum is separated into smaller segments called lobes. In the case of our cerebellum, each hemisphere has an anterior and a posterior lobe, and those govern subconscious aspects of skeletal muscle movements. I never can pronounce that next one. I always just call it the F lobe, which is on the inferior surface, and it contributes to equilibrium and balance. Okay. Our cerebellum is connected to the brainstem via 3 pairs of what we call cerebellar peduncles. And these are bundles of white matter, and that consists of axons conducting impulses between the cerebellum and other parts of the brain, helping to coordinate movement, regulate posture and balance. So you kind of see, got a lot of things related to balance and equilibrium, posture. Overall, what is the most important thing that your cerebellum does? It evaluates how well movements initiated by motor areas in the cerebrum are actually being carried out. Okay. So I tell students this every semester that I think of the cerebellum kind of like the human resources. If you don't know what human resources is, like companies have it just to make sure things are being done correctly by the book. Okay. Your cerebellum isn't what's controlling your skeletal muscle movements. Okay. That's what the cerebrum is doing. Okay. But your cerebellum is making sure that those signals are being carried out correctly. Okay. There's going to be signals coming back from muscles to the cerebellum and saying, you know, this was a signal. Am I doing it right? Basically, stuff like that. Okay. So when movements initiated by the cerebromotor areas are not being carried out correctly, our cerebellum detects those discrepancies. We then send feedback signals out to the motor areas of the cortex via its connection to the thalamus. The feedback signals help correct the errors, smooth the movements, and coordinate complex sequences of skeletal muscle contractions. Okay. So it's just, you know, a coordinator. It's a regulator. Doesn't really do the job. It's just making sure it's getting done correctly. Your cerebellum also is the main brain region that regulates your posture and balance, which I've already kind of mentioned a couple of times. These aspects of cerebellar function make possible all skilled activities. Okay, all skilled muscular activities, simple as, you know, running, catching a baseball, dancing, speaking, and, you know, every type of motion is going to need good balance and posture. Otherwise, we'll, you know, fall over. It's, you know, the old saying, can you walk and chew gum at the same time? We can. Hopefully, everybody can. And you can thank your cerebellum for that. The presence of reciprocal connections between the cerebellum and association areas of the cortex suggests that the cerebellum may also play roles in non-motor things. Functions such as cognition, which is the acquisition of knowledge, so getting smarter, learning, in other words, and then language processing, so understanding what you're hearing me say right now. So your cerebellum might also play a role in those things. Okay, moving on to the diencephalon, which is that segment of the brain above your brain stem. We're going to talk about the thalamuses, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the epithalamus. First part of the diencephalon I'm talking about is a pair of oval gray masses of gray matter at the superior end of the brainstem, beneath the cerebral hemisphere, as we call these, your thalamus. Okay. The nickname for the thalamus is, and I do want you to know, that's why I had you write it out, is the gateway to the cerebral cortex. Okay, we call it that because of the first function that I have listed here. It is the major relay station for most sensory impulses that reach the primary sensory areas of our cerebral cortex from our spinal cord and our brainstem. In other words, when we have a sensory signal that we have the ability to be aware of, like when we walk outside on today, or on, you know, on a day like today, and it's cold, you feel that cold, you're instantly aware that it's cold. When you're itchy, you're aware of that. When you're in pain, you're aware of that. You have that perception, right? Most of those sensory signals, itchy, hot, cold, pain, pressure, most of those sensory signals are ultimately going to go to the cerebral cortex. Before they get to the cerebral cortex, they make a pit stop. And they make that pit stop here. Okay. So when we talk about sensations, which will be in 2 more lectures, not the next lecture, but lecture, the first one of next unit. So we'll be getting into some of this next week. Okay. You're going to see the thalamus is involved with a lot of those things. Okay. And then from there, the signal will travel up to the cerebral cortex and be processed. And not every sensory signal, but for most sensory impulses. So it's obviously involved with sensations and sensory function, but your thalamus is also going to contribute to motor functions, and it does so by transmitting information from the cerebellum and basal ganglia to the primary motor area of your cerebral cortex. So it helps transmit between those parts of the brain. It relays nerve impulses between different areas of the cerebrum. It plays a role in the maintenance of consciousness, which we just learned is that state of wakefulness where you're alert. We also have within the thalamus several groups of nuclei on the sides, functioning in things like emotions, memory, learning, cognition, sensory information, auditory impulses, visual impulses, arousal, and even olfaction, which is a fancy word for smell. So your thalamus heavily involved with sensations, but also several other things. Okay. All right, our next structure, part of the brain that you're probably going to get very tired of hearing about, because you're going to basically hear about it all semester long. Okay. We can describe our hypothalamus as the major control center of our autonomic nervous system, as well as our endocrine system. Okay. So thinking back to when we talked the other day about the autonomic nervous system, we talked about things like sympathetic, parasympathetic, fight or flight, rest and digest, controlling things automatically. Your hypothalamus is in charge of those things. Okay. So it produces autonomic effects like influencing heart rate, blood pressure, secretion and motility of your stomach and intestines, among many, many other things. Okay. Well, if you think back earlier today, I said that your medulla influences heart rate and blood pressure. Well, now I'm telling you that the hypothalamus is doing that. So which is it? Okay. Well, it's both. Okay. The hypothalamus is numero uno in charge. He tells the medulla what to do. The medulla does the job. Kind of like, being in the workforce. Okay. You have a boss, they might tell you what to do, and then you have to do it, right? And the hypothalamus is the boss. Okay. Now, your hypothalamus is also in charge of your endocrine system. The endocrine system is the very next system that we're going to talk about in Unit 3, once we get done talking about the nervous system. Okay. Remember from our very first lecture that the endocrine system, along with the nervous system, those are the two major systems most responsible for maintaining homeostasis. We learned that the endocrine system uses hormones instead of actual potentials. Well, although your hypothalamus is a brain structure, it also produces hormones. So it's endocrine in function. It secretes several hormones. Okay. Well, if I go back to this picture, just so I can show you the hypothalamus, and hanging down from the hypothalamus, which hypothalamus right here, is a structure called the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland is strictly an endocrine organ. Okay. Its job is just to release hormones. It really is not a brain function, a brain structure. It just hangs down from the brain. Okay. Well, there's two parts to the pituitary, an anterior half and a posterior half. Posterior pituitary and anterior pituitary are completely separate from one another. Okay. Well, our hypothalamus releases 7 hormones that influence the activity of the anterior pituitary. Okay. They either tell the anterior pituitary to release hormones or basically tell the anterior pituitary not to release hormones. And in doing so, the hypothalamus helps regulate, along with the activity of the anterior pituitary, things like growth, metabolism, reproduction, and your responses to stress. Okay. There's 2 more hormones that your hypothalamus produce, but they are produced by the hypothalamus in their cell bodies. But then the hormones are transferred down, so they're carried down to the posterior pituitary, who actually does the releasing of them. We've actually talked about one of those hormones, oxytocin, when we talked about positive feedback. We talked about oxytocin because that's the hormone that women secrete when they're going through childbirth. Remember, we learned about the strong contractions of the uterus. It's oxytocin that's causing that. Okay. Another hormone's released. I'm not even going to mention it. We're going to get into all that hormone stuff here in the next couple of weeks when we move into Unit 3. Okay. So your hypothalamus is heavily involved with a lot of stuff that we have talked about and we'll talk about. Okay. It's also involved with several other indispensable life functions. Okay. Something we've talked about since the very beginning of the semester is the regulation of body temperature. Okay. Using negative feedback, you can describe your hypothalamus as having basically your body's thermostat. Okay. Thermostat in your house controls what the temperature is inside by either telling the air conditioner to kick on or telling the heater to kick on. Okay. Well, your hypothalamus can cause you to shiver when you get cold. It can tell you to sweat when you get hot. Okay. those signals coming from our skin telling us that we're cold, that we're hot, ultimately go to the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus decides what to do with that information. Your hypothalamus helps regulate your food and water intake. It monitors your blood glucose or blood sugar, as well as your amino acid levels. And if those things are low, for example, it makes you hungry. That way you eat and those levels go up. If they're elevated where they need to be, it's going to make you feel satiated, satisfied, or full. Okay. When I say that it monitors your water intake, it's monitoring what we call our osmolarity of blood. Basically, it's just your water balance. And if our blood osmolarity is off, like our water levels are too low, it's going to make you thirsty. Okay. This happens when we're dehydrated. If you're thirsty, you drink more water, and that helps fix it, right? Hopefully, that's pretty straightforward. Your hypothalamus helps you go to sleep. It helps you wake up. It helps establish what we call our circadian rhythms. Okay. Your circadian rhythms are your biological clock. Now, when you hear somebody describe their biological clock, what they might be saying is, I'm 24, I need to get married. I'm 35, I need to settle down and buy a house. No, that's not your biological clock. Okay. Your biological clock, your circadian rhythms, that's a 24-hour cycle of events that occur on a daily basis. Okay. Not only does it include your sleep-wake cycle, a very important part of our circadian rhythms are our sleep-wake cycle, but it's also fluctuations in body temperature, fluctuations in hormone release. So a lot of different things that fluctuate throughout the day on a 24-hour cycle of events. Okay. Your hypothalamus helps with memory. It lies in the pathway of signals traveling from the hippocampus, which is an important memory center of the brain, on its way to the thalamus. And then along with other components of your limbic system, your hypothalamus is involved with emotions, things like anger, aggression, fear, pleasure, contentment, as well as sexual drive and orgasm. So if on the exam you come across a question where I ask you something happening, you don't know what it is, there's a pretty good chance you could go with the hypothalamus just because it does so many dang different things. And hopefully that doesn't happen to you, but you know, when in doubt, hypothalamus, it might not be a bad choice. Now, this next slide and the slide after that are the exact same thing, just with the exception of one bullet at the end. I forgot, I added something and then forgot to delete this slide, so I'm just going to jump ahead one more slide. Not going to read it twice. Okay, your epithalamus, the final structure of the final main structure, I should say, final main structure of the diencephalon. Small region superior and posterior to the thalamus, consists of two structures, the pineal gland and the habenular nuclei, I guess is how you pronounce that. But the pineal gland is kind of the major structure. It produces a chemical called melatonin. This is a timekeeping hormone that helps set your biological clock, your circadian rhythms. Okay. We may have heard of melatonin before. You can actually buy that over the counter. A lot of parents like to buy melatonin gummies for their kids when they're being rotten and not liking sleep, like my kids. Sometimes we have to give them melatonin when they're too wound up. But it's a hormone that we produce. Okay. Naturally, we produce it. You can get it over the counter, obviously. I just told you guys, though, that your circadian rhythms and sleep was regulated by your hypothalamus. Well, it's kind of the same situation. Your hypothalamus is in charge. Okay. There are nuclei in the hypothalamus, suprachiasmatic nuclei, that regulate the secretion of melatonin by the pineal gland. Okay. Now, don't confuse the chemical melatonin with the chemical melanin. Okay. Melanin is what gives us our skin color, our hair color. It determines if we have freckles. Okay. Melanin is a pigment. It's a protein. This is a hormone. Okay. Melatonin and melanin, very different. Okay. But once again, I kind of already read through that next bullet there, but remember, sleep wake cycles, one part of our circadian rhythms. It's not the only thing. Things like the secretion of hormones and body temperature fluctuations occurring on a 24-hour cycle of events. The other part of our epithalamus is what we call the habenular nuclei, and they're involved with olfaction or smell, especially emotional responses to odors. And I'm sure you've all experienced, some type of smell that triggered an emotional response, sometimes good, sometimes bad. A lot of times it's something that might trigger a memory, or, like when you smell something specific, makes you think of something in a good or bad way. So your epithalamus and that habenular nuclei responsible for it. Now, not so much a singular structure, but kind of a few parts to some things in our diencephalon are these things called circumventricular organs, or CVOs. We find them in the wall of our third ventricle, one of those chambers in our brain that has cerebrospinal fluid. These CVOs have the ability to monitor chemical changes in our blood because they lack a blood-brain barrier. Okay. Parts of the CVOs include stuff from the hypothalamus, the pineal gland, pituitary gland, and a few nearby structures. And more importantly is what they do. So that first bullet there, they help coordinate homeostatic activities of the endocrine and nervous systems, things like regulating blood pressure, fluid balance, hunger, and thirst. Not that I'm going to ask you this on the exam, but I thought it's interesting. It's also thought to be the site where HIV, the virus that hopefully nobody ever has to deal with, could enter the brain and can lead to dementia and other neurological disorders. So obviously a bad situation there. Okay, so now we have finally gotten to the big dog of the brain, which, as I've said already, the largest and most complex of our brain, part of our brain, your cerebrum. Okay, represents about 80%. So by far and away, the biggest part of our brain. Consists of two halves. I've talked about this already when I was talking about the two halves of the cerebellum. We call these the cerebral hemispheres. Okay. Overall, our cerebrum can be described as what provides us with the ability to read, to write, to speak, make calculations, compose music, remember the past, plan for the future, imagine things that have never existed before. Okay. It's the stuff that really separates us from other animals. Okay. I always talk about like my dogs. We have two now. We used to have one, but we got another one now. Their life is not about the future or composing music or sitting in a classroom listening to an instructor talk for an hour and a half twice a week. They sit around, they like naps, they like their belly rub, they like treats. That's it. That's as complicated as it gets for dogs. Now, you can teach dogs a lot of different things, but still their life is pretty darn simple compared to ours. Okay. We can divide each of those hemispheres into 4 lobes. Okay, they're color coded here in our picture on the right. We have deep to the frontal bone, the 2 frontal lobes. Deep to the parietal bones will be where you find the parietal lobes. In the back of your brain, deep to the occipital bone are the 2 occipital lobes. And on the sides, deep to the temporal bones will be the temporal lobes. Okay. Now there is a 5th part to the cerebrum, but you can't see it at the surface. Okay. That's why it's not labeled here. They do project it to the surface. If you look real hard, I know this is probably kind of small on your figure, but it's a structure called the insula. It's just like a 5th lobe, but you'd have to kind of pull the brain apart to find it. Okay. Now, I mentioned earlier that both the cerebrum and the cerebellum have outward folds. Okay. Each fold of the cerebrum has a special name. It's called a gyrus. Okay. Over here, you see the word gyri. That's just the plural form of gyrus. Okay. These are the folds. Okay. Think of them like little tiny hills. Okay. And they correspond with tiny little depressions or valleys, I should say. Each depression is called a sulcus. Okay. Whereas you see over here, sulci, that's just the plural form of sulcus. Okay. So it's just a series of peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys, peaks and valleys. And what that does is it increases the surface area, the amount of cerebrum that we have. More importantly, it increases the amount of cerebral cortex. that we have. And once again, that's the very thin shell where that gray matter is, which provides us with some amazing, amazing things that we're going to talk about here on the very next slide. Okay. Now, a sulcus is a small depression. In some places, like right here, we have a deep depression. Those are called fissures. And they just help separate, in this case, longitudinal fissure separates the two hemispheres. There's a transverse fissure here. It separates the cerebrum from the cerebellum. Okay. That's more anatomy-based stuff, but I wanted to kind of talk about. Okay. Now, I want to talk really quickly about a special sulcus, what we call the central sulcus. It's this depression right here between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. Okay. And why is it important? Well, really, it's not. But what's in front of it and what's behind it really is. What we call the precentral gyrus is right in front of it. And right behind it is what we call the postcentral gyrus. Okay. The precentral gyrus, this area right here in our frontal lobe, contains association neurons called upper motor neurons. These are the neurons that help control motor neurons of the spinal cord. In other words, these are the neurons, this area of our brain, that's where all signaling originates for skeletal muscle contraction. And remember, your right brain controls the left side of your body, so we can see the right side of the brain here. That means right here, all of this part of our brain would control the left side of our body. Okay. Just behind that central sulcus is what we call the postcentral gyrus. It is where the senses arising from our skin, muscles, tendons, and joints end up being processed. So when you're itchy, when you're hot, when you're cold, when you touch something, when you have a stretch of a muscle, a tendon or a joint, pressure, something like that, those signals are ultimately going to end up here. Okay. Now, what I'm describing to you are two of our most important functional areas of the cerebral cortex. Okay. So let's read through and I'll explain that. Specific types of sensory, motor, and integrative signals are processed in certain regions of the cerebral cortex. We call these areas functional areas. The pretty straightforward description is as follows. Generally, sensory areas receive sensory information. So in other words, this is where sensory signals end up and are involved with perception, conscious awareness of a sensation. So like right now, you're utilizing your primary visual area to process what you see. You're using your primary auditory area to process what you hear. Okay. Motor areas control the execution of voluntary movements. That's that primary motor area that I was just talking about. In that area, what we call the precentral gyrus. Okay. This area right here controls contraction of skeletal muscles and skeletal muscle groups. Okay. Whereas association areas, those deal with a lot more complex integrative functions like your memory, emotions, your reasoning, your will, your judgment, personality traits, and intelligence. Okay. Looking on the next slide is an illustration where some of those are mapped out, and there are a lot of them. If you were to actually open up your textbook, which you'd have to do by getting on Canvas and doing that, which I imagine nobody will do or has done, you're going to find that there are many more that are in our body than what's listed here. Okay. And many more than what I have listed on this previous page. What I've done is, I don't know, it's something like 10, kind of picked out what I feel like were some of the most important ones for you to know. And I'm just giving you a very brief description on what that functional area does for you. The primary somatosensory area is what I was just describing. Receives impulses for touch, pressure, vibration, itch, tickle, temperature, pain, and proprioception. So in other words, all sensory signals coming from your skin, muscles, tendons, and joints. Okay. And once again, that was going to the postcentral gyrus, okay, which in our figure here on the next page, sorry, precentral gyrus. No, yeah, it is postcentral gyrus. Sorry, I was thinking this was front. It's this shaded blue area. Okay. Whereas in front of that central sulcus, in that precentral gyrus, is the primary motor cortex or primary motor area. And that's where the signals that cause voluntary contraction of specific muscles or muscle groups originates. Okay. The others are pretty, hopefully, straightforward as far as their name goes. The primary visual area is what you're using right now to process what you're visually seeing and is involved with visual perception. You're also using your primary auditory area to understand what you're hearing, so auditory perception. Your primary gustatory area, gustatory or gestation is a fancy word for taste. So when you taste something, you're using that area. When you smell, you're using the primary olfactory area. Olfactory or olfaction, fancy word for smell. A couple special named ones. Broca's speech area is involved with articulation of speech, so like forming words. I'm using that right now. Most often we find that in the left hemisphere. Wernicke's area is what allows you to interpret the meaning of speech by recognizing spoken words. So you guys are using that because hopefully you're understanding that I'm speaking words. Facial recognition area, something that's important so that we can recognize people. It stores information about faces, allows you to recognize people by their faces. When I was in college, I remember taking psychology, and my professor talked about people that get brain damage sometimes can hurt this area of their brain, and they no longer can really recognize people by their faces, and they kind of just describe people as having like a face that's like blurred, like what you see on TV when they try to not show somebody who they really are. So that's kind of crazy. Auditory association area, don't confuse that with the primary auditory area, but that's the area that allows you to recognize sound, speech, music, noise. So in other words, it's what allows you not to understand that I'm not singing right now. Okay, to understand that I'm not, just like making random clicks and pops and noise. I'm actually speaking words. Okay. The prefrontal cortex, this is a huge area in your frontal lobe. It's this whole yellow shaded area. This is what's unique about every one of us. It gives us our personality, our intellect, our complex learning abilities, the ability to recall information, have initiative, judgment, your foresight, your reasoning, your conscience, intuition, your mood, your planning for the future, development of abstract ideas. We have a very pronounced prefrontal cortex. Okay. Unfortunately, its location kind of sucks. Okay. And I say that because it's just behind your forehead, right? Well, a lot of times when people get their head hurt, they hit their forehead on something like a steering wheel in a car accident, or they trip and fall and they go face first down into the pavement. Okay. And when you get a traumatic brain injury that affects the prefrontal cortex, it's not uncommon for people to really have a change in their personality. I remember learning this in psychology, where people can be like the sweetest person on earth before injury and then completely turn into the biggest butthead and be really irritable and stuff like that post injury. So unfortunate. If you haven't picked up on it, psychology, really, really cool stuff. So take it if you haven't already. Okay, I'm going to stop here because we are just about out of time. We got through a great portion of the lecture, and that's fantastic. What I'm going to do